Heather Lavelle Keaton. What if the very person you trusted to keep you safe, the woman who tucked you into bed, who should have been a mother, was secretly planning your death? In 2010, in Alabama, 2 children learned that lesson in the most tragic way possible. Their stepmother, Heather Lavelle Keaton, turned their home into a torture chamber, and the story that followed would shock the nation. Heather wasn't a headline at first. She was a 20-something woman from Kentucky, seemingly ordinary, trying to build a family with her boyfriend, John DeBlaise. John had 2 young children, Natalie, age 4, and Chase, age 3. Together, they looked like a blended family, trying to make things work. But beneath that surface, Heather was harboring a darkness no one saw coming. From the beginning, Heather struggled with her role as stepmother. Friends noticed she was harsh, impatient, quick to anger. Instead of warmth, she showed resentment. Instead of nurturing, she showed control. And as the months went on, that control turned into cruelty. Investigators later pieced together a timeline that reads like a horror story. Heather started small, limiting food, punishing with long periods of isolation, but she wanted more than obedience. She wanted domination. The methods she chose were unimaginable. For little Natalie, just 4 years old, Heather used duct tape to strap her tiny wrists to a broom handle. Bound and helpless, Natalie couldn't move, couldn't fight back. Heather left her like that for hours. The child's lungs compressed, her breathing grew shallow, and slowly, terrifyingly, she suffocated. Chase, only 3 years old, met a death just as horrifying. Heather forced him into a suitcase, duct taping his fragile body. Imagine it. A toddler sealed away in darkness, his cries muffled, his fists pounding against fabric. Struggling for air, he eventually went still. Autopsy reports later revealed something even more chilling. Both children had antifreeze in their systems, poison, used alongside physical torture. This wasn't just rage. This was calculated murder. And what did Heather and John do once the children were gone? They didn't mourn. They didn't call police. They didn't even attempt a burial. Instead, they dumped the children's bodies in wooded areas, discarding them like trash. For months, their absence went unnoticed. Life went on, as if Natalie and Chase had never existed. But the truth always finds a way to surface. When police finally uncovered the story, Alabama was shaken. Prosecutors zeroed in on Heather as the ringleader. John might have been their biological father, but Heather's cold, manipulative influence drove the violence. In the courtroom, testimony painted her as someone who demanded total control, who relished power, and who showed not a shred of remorse. Jurors heard the details: duct tape, broom handles, suitcases, poison. They saw photos of the wooded areas where the children's remains were found. And as the picture of Heather emerged, it became clear this wasn't discipline. This wasn't punishment gone too far. This was sadism. In 2015, the gavel came down. Heather Lavelle Keaton was sentenced to death, making her the first woman in Alabama's history to receive the death penalty for killing her stepchildren. It was a historic moment, one that underscored just how monstrous her crimes were. For many, the most haunting part of Heather's case isn't the brutality itself, but the betrayal. Children are taught to fear monsters under the bed, but for Natalie and Chase, the monster lived in their home. She wasn't a shadow in the night, she was Mom. Heather's name now stands as a chilling reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, how trust can be weaponized, how the role of mother can be twisted into something unrecognizable. And for Alabama, her case will forever mark the moment when the justice system decided that even women, if cruel enough, can earn a place on death row. Lisa Graham. Some murders happen in a moment, quick, violent, shocking. But others happen slowly, stretched out over weeks, months, even years. And in Alabama in 2004, one little girl endured a form of torture that was as deliberate as it was cruel. Her name was Stephanie Graham, just 8 years old. And her stepmother, Lisa Graham, didn't stab, shoot, or suffocate her. Instead, she used the cruelest weapon of all, starvation. At first glance, Lisa Graham didn't look like a killer. She was a woman who blended into the background, grocery shopping, chatting with neighbors, attending church. To outsiders, she seemed like any other mother. But behind closed doors, Lisa was waging a slow, methodical war against her stepdaughter. Stephanie's nightmare was invisible at first, a skipped meal here, a glass of water denied there. But those skipped meals became a pattern, and that pattern became a sentence. Lisa locked her in her room for long stretches of time, deliberately withholding food and water. Stephanie's young body weakened. She begged for scraps, she cried for relief. None came. By the time authorities discovered what had happened, it was too late. Stephanie was dead. And when investigators examined her body, the evidence was undeniable. She weighed just 39 pounds, the size of a toddler, not an 8-year-old. Her frame was skeletal, her face hollow, her organs weakened from months of malnutrition and dehydration. This wasn't an illness. This was systematic torture. The courtroom became a stage of horror as doctors testified. They described brittle bones, dehydrated tissues, the unmistakable signs of starvation. Jurors looked at photos that left them shaken. Witnesses spoke of how Stephanie had disappeared from public view, how Lisa had kept her hidden away as she wasted. And Lisa? She denied everything. She insisted she was strict, not cruel, that her discipline was misunderstood. But the evidence shredded her claims. Neighbors recalled not seeing Stephanie, and outside for months. Investigators found a room that had been used as her prison. The puzzle pieces all told the same story. Lisa had slowly killed her child. Unlike other crimes of passion, starvation requires planning. It requires consistency. It means looking at a hungry child every single day and choosing not to help. Lisa's cruelty wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. In 2007, the jury delivered its verdict. Lisa Graham was sentenced to death. Alabama had spoken once again. There is no place in this world for a mother who starves her child to death. What makes Lisa's case especially haunting is the nature of the abuse. Heather's crimes were violent and sudden. Lisa's were slow and methodical. Stephanie woke up every morning to the same nightmare, a mother figure who had decided she would not be allowed to live. The betrayal runs deep. Children rely on parents for the basics of survival: food, shelter, and water. Lisa weaponized those necessities, turning them into instruments of control and cruelty. In the end, she didn't just fail her stepdaughter. She watched her die, piece by piece. For Alabama, the case was a wake-up call. It forced communities to ask, How many other children are suffering in silence, hidden behind closed doors? And it showed that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears the face of a smiling mother at church. Lisa Graham's name now lives in infamy, not because of how quickly she killed, but because of how long she chose not to stop. Tiffany Nicole Moss. What if the woman entrusted to nurture and protect a child became her executioner? What if the very hands that should have fed her instead withheld every morsel of food until there was nothing left but skin stretched over brittle bones? In the quiet suburbs of Lawrenceville, Georgia, neighbors would occasionally glimpse a small figure through the windows of the Moss household. 10-year-old Imani Gabrielle Moss, with her bright eyes and infectious smile, seemed like any other child in the neighborhood. But behind those suburban walls, a horror story was unfolding that would shock even seasoned investigators and expose catastrophic failures in Georgia's child welfare system. Tiffany Nicole Moss didn't birth Imani, but she held absolute power over the child's existence. As her stepmother, Tiffany wielded authority with the precision of a medieval torturer. Day by day, meal by meal, she systematically starved this innocent child, while the rest of the world remained oblivious to the nightmare playing out in plain sight. The abuse began subtly, missed meals disguised as punishment, portions growing smaller under the guise of discipline. But Tiffany's cruelty knew no bounds. She transformed what should have been a loving home into a concentration camp, with Imani as her sole prisoner. The child's weight plummeted from a healthy 68 pounds to a skeletal 32 pounds. Her body began consuming itself, desperately trying to survive as Tiffany watched with cold indifference. But starvation was only part of Tiffany's sadistic repertoire. She subjected Imani to relentless physical and psychological torture. The little girl was beaten, burned, and subjected to punishments that defied human comprehension. Tiffany would force Imani to perform exhausting physical exercises while denying her food, creating a cycle of torment that grew more severe with each passing day. The most chilling aspect of this case wasn't just Tiffany's methodical cruelty, it was how the aspect, the system designed to protect children, failed so catastrophically. Child Protective Services had received multiple reports about Imani's condition. Caseworkers had visited the home. Teachers had raised concerns. Yet somehow, this child slipped through every safety net, left to suffer in silence while the adults around her filed paperwork and closed cases. On the 2nd of November 2013, Imani's tortured body finally surrendered. When emergency responders arrived, they found a child so emaciated she barely looked human. Her body bore the evidence of months of systematic abuse, burns, bruises, and the unmistakable signs of prolonged starvation. Even hardened first responders wept at the scene. During the investigation, the full scope of Tiffany's depravity emerged. She had kept detailed records of her punishments, treating Imani's suffering like a twisted science experiment. Text messages revealed her callous discussions about the child's deteriorating condition, showing not remorse but annoyance at having to deal with the problem. The trial painted Tiffany as a master manipulator who had convinced everyone, including Imani's father, that her extreme methods were necessary. Discipline. She presented herself as the victim, claiming she was overwhelmed and under-resourced. But the evidence told a different story. This was calculated, sustained torture of a defenseless child. The jury saw through Tiffany's act. In 2018, After deliberating for just 2 hours, they sentenced her to death. The judge called it one of the most heinous child abuse cases in Georgia's history. As Tiffany was led away in shackles, she showed the same cold indifference that had characterized her treatment of Imani. But the real tragedy extends beyond one woman's evil. Imani's death exposed systemic failures that allowed a child to be tortured to death while under government supervision. Reform efforts followed, but they came too late for one bright little girl whose only crime was trusting the adults meant to protect her. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis. Picture the perfect military wife, supportive, devoted, standing by her husband through deployments and hardships. Now imagine discovering that behind that facade lurked a cold-blooded killer who viewed her family not as loved ones, but as walking insurance policies waiting to be cashed in. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis mastered the art of deception long before she committed murder. In Norfolk, Virginia, she cultivated an image of respectability that fooled neighbors, friends, and even law enforcement, at least initially. She was the kind of woman who baked cookies for church functions and sent care packages to deployed soldiers. But beneath this carefully constructed persona beat the heart of a calculating predator. The year 2002 would prove pivotal in Teresa's deadly game. She had married Julian Lewis, a Navy serviceman, and inherited his son C.J. Lewis as part of the package. To the outside world, they appeared to be a loving, blended family. Julian was devoted to his wife, working hard to provide for their household while serving his country. C.J., now 25 and building his own life, maintained a close relationship with his father. But Teresa saw something different when she looked at these men. Dollar signs. The insurance policies were substantial. Julian's military life insurance, combined with additional policies they had purchased, painted a picture of financial security for any surviving spouse. C.J.'s policies, while smaller, still represented a significant windfall. In Teresa's twisted calculus, these two men were worth more dead than alive. What makes Teresa's crime particularly chilling is the methodical planning involved. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of madness. It was a business transaction orchestrated with military precision. She began cultivating relationships with individuals willing to commit murder for money, spinning elaborate stories about abuse and fear to justify what she was planning. Teresa found her, a weapon in the form of hired killers, men desperate enough for money to take lives for cash. She painted herself as a victim, claiming Julian was abusive and that she feared for her safety. The lies flowed effortlessly from her lips, each fabrication designed to make her conspirators feel like heroes rather than murderers. On the 18th of November, 2002, Teresa's deadly plan unfolded with horrific efficiency. Julian Lewis was shot and killed in what initially appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. But investigators quickly realized something didn't add up. The crime scene felt staged, the robbery unconvincing. When they dug deeper into the family's finances and relationships, Teresa's web of deception began to unravel. The investigation revealed that Teresa hadn't been content with just eliminating Julian. C.J. Lewis, her stepson, represented both a witness and another insurance payout. In her cold calculation, he had to die too. The same hitmen who killed Julian were contracted to murder C.J., turning this from a single homicide into a family annihilation plot. When C.J. was found dead, The pieces of Teresa's puzzle finally clicked into place for investigators. The timing, the insurance policies, the staged crime scenes. It all pointed back to the grieving widow who had been playing the victim while orchestrating mass murder. The evidence against Teresa was overwhelming. Phone records, financial transactions, and witness testimony painted a clear picture of a woman who had commodified human life. Her co-conspirators, facing their own legal troubles, cooperated with investigators, providing detailed accounts of Teresa's role as the mastermind behind the killings. During her trial, Teresa maintained her innocence, still playing the role of the victimized widow. But the jury saw through her performance. The evidence was too comprehensive, the motive too clear. In 2004, she was sentenced to death for her role in orchestrating the murders of Julian and C.J. Lewis. Teresa's journey to the execution chamber was relatively swift by death row standards. On the 23rd of September 2010, she became the first woman executed in Virginia in nearly a century. Her final words were reportedly expressions of love for her family, the same family she had destroyed for money. As the lethal injection took effect, justice was finally served for Julian and C.J. Lewis. But the case serves as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that sometimes the greatest threat comes from those closest to us, those we trust with our lives, our hearts, and our futures. Emma Tustin. What happens when a child's smile disappears forever? What do you call a woman who transforms a 6-year-old's laughter into screams of agony, then silence? In the quiet suburban streets of Solihull, England, neighbors had no idea they were living next door to one of the most depraved child killers in British history. Arthur Labinjo Hughes should have been learning to read, playing with toys, and discovering the world around him. Instead, this beautiful 6-year-old boy, with bright eyes and an infectious grin, became trapped in a nightmare orchestrated by the woman who was supposed to love him as her own. Emma Tustin didn't just fail Arthur. She systematically destroyed him piece by piece, day by torturous day. The year 2020 brought lockdown to Britain, but for Arthur, isolation meant something far more sinister than staying home from school. While other children complained about missing friends and playgrounds, Arthur was imprisoned in his own home by Emma Tustin, a 2-year-old woman whose capacity for cruelty knew no bounds. She had convinced Arthur's father, Thomas Hughes, that extreme discipline was necessary to control the boy. What she was really doing was slowly murdering a child while his father watched. Emma's torture regime began with starvation. She would force Arthur to stand in hallways for up to 14 hours a day, denying him food and water while she ate meals in front of him. Security cameras, ironically installed by Thomas to monitor Arthur's behavior, captured the boy's desperate attempts to drink from toilet bowls when his thirst became unbearable. The footage shows a child so dehydrated and starved that he could barely stand, swaying like a ghost in his own home. But Emma's sadistic creativity extended far beyond starvation. She force-fed Arthur salt until his sodium levels reached life-threatening heights, causing seizures and brain damage. She would make him sleep on the floor, deny him access to bathrooms, and subject him to beatings that left him covered in bruises. The 6-year-old's weight plummeted from 28 pounds to just 24 pounds, his body literally wasting away under Emma's systematic abuse. The psychological torture was equally devastating. Audio recordings captured Emma's voice screaming at Arthur, calling him vile names and threatening him with violence. She convinced the child that he was worthless, that his suffering was his own fault. She isolated him from any source of comfort, turning his father against him and ensuring that Arthur faced his torment completely alone. On the 16th of June 2020, Emma's torture campaign reached its horrific conclusion. Security footage showed her violently shaking Arthur before slamming his head against a hard surface with such force that it caused fatal brain injuries. Even as the little boy lay dying, Emma showed no remorse. She waited 12 minutes before calling emergency services, precious time that might have saved Arthur's life. When paramedics arrived, they found Arthur unconscious and barely breathing. His tiny body bore the evidence of months of systematic torture, bruises in various stages of healing, signs of malnutrition, and the catastrophic head injury that would ultimately kill him. Medical professionals who treated Arthur said they had never seen such extensive abuse in a child so young. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Emma's depravity. Text messages showed her complaining about Arthur as if he were an inconvenience rather than a child in her care. She had documented her own abuse, sending photos and videos to friends that showed Arthur's deteriorating condition. Most chillingly, she seemed to take pleasure in the boy's suffering, viewing his pain as entertainment. During her trial, Emma attempted to shift blame to Arthur's father, claiming she was also a victim. But the evidence was overwhelming. The security footage, medical evidence, and her own recorded admissions painted a clear picture of a woman who had tortured a child to death for her own twisted satisfaction. The judge's words during sentencing captured the horror of Emma's crimes. "You are a fiend, a person who is cruel beyond belief." She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 29 years. As she was led away, Arthur's family finally had justice, but nothing could bring back the innocent child whose life had been stolen by unspeakable cruelty. Arthur's death sparked nationwide outrage and led to serious questions about how the child protection system had failed so catastrophically. This little boy had been failed by every adult who should have protected him, but none more so than Emma Tustin, the woman who turned love into torture and home into hell. Chaquinta Jones. Imagine discovering that your neighbor, the woman who waves hello each morning and takes out her trash like clockwork, has been systematically torturing a 5-year-old child to death behind closed doors. This is the nightmare that unfolded in Indianapolis, Indiana, when Chaquinta Jones revealed herself to be one of the most sadistic child killers in the state's history. Jaquan Wilson was just 5 years old when his world collapsed around him. This bright, energetic little boy should have been starting kindergarten, learning his ABCs, and playing with friends. Instead, he found himself trapped in the care of Chaquinta Jones, a 2-year-old woman whose idea of childcare involved systematic torture that would make seasoned investigators physically ill. The year 2006 started like any other for the Wilson family, but it would end in unimaginable tragedy. Jaquan's father had entered into a relationship with Chaquinta, trusting her to help care for his son. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, as he unknowingly delivered his child into the hands of a monster disguised as a loving stepmother. Chaquinta's abuse of Jaquan wasn't the result of lost temper or momentary rage. It was a calculated campaign of torture that escalated over months. She began with what she called discipline, but her punishments bore no resemblance to normal parental correction. She would beat Jae-kwon with various objects, leaving bruises and welts across his small body. When those marks began to heal, she would create new ones, ensuring the child was in constant pain. The true scope of Chakinta's depravity only became clear during the investigation. Medical examiners found over 70 separate injuries on Jae-kwon's body, each telling its own story of suffering. There were burns from cigarettes and hot objects, systematically placed across his torso and limbs, broken bones that had been left to heal improperly, causing the child ongoing agony, bruises in various stages of healing that painted a timeline of sustained abuse. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that Chakinta had been escalating her torture over time. Early injuries were less severe, suggesting she was testing boundaries and building toward the ultimate act of violence. She seemed to take pleasure in finding new ways to inflict pain, treating Jae-kwon like a laboratory subject in her twisted experiments with cruelty. The little boy's ordeal finally ended in November 2006, but not through rescue, through death. Chakinta's final act of violence was so severe that it caused fatal internal injuries. Even then, she showed no remorse. When emergency responders arrived, she attempted to claim Jae-kwon had fallen, despite the overwhelming evidence of prolonged abuse covering his body. The investigation revealed that Jae-kwon had been crying out for help in the only ways a 5-year-old could. Teachers had noticed behavioral changes, bruises that couldn't be explained away, and the child's obvious fear of going home. But somehow, the system designed to protect children had failed once again, leaving Jae-kwon to face his tormentor alone. During the trial, the full horror of Chakinta's crimes was laid bare. Medical testimony described injuries so severe that experienced doctors struggled to maintain their composure. The prosecution painted a picture of a woman who had systematically tortured an innocent child for her own sadistic pleasure, showing no mercy even as his small body began to shut down from the trauma. Chakinta's defense attempted to portray her as overwhelmed and struggling with mental health issues, but the evidence told a different story. The calculated nature of the abuse, the escalating severity, and her attempts to cover up the crimes all pointed to a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and chose to continue anyway. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding Chakinta guilty on all counts. The judge's sentencing was swift and uncompromising. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the gavel fell, Jae-kwon's family finally had justice, but the scars left by his loss would never fully heal. Chakinta Jones sits in prison today, where she will remain until she dies. But her legacy lives on in the broken hearts of Jae-kwon's family and in the reforms that followed his death. This 5-year-old boy's suffering was not in vain if it prevents even one other child from experiencing the same horrors at the hands of someone trusted to protect them. The case serves as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that children are often most vulnerable to those who should love them most. Jae-kwon Wilson deserved a childhood filled with laughter and love. Instead, he got Chakinta Jones, and that difference cost him everything. Diana Medina Flores. What kind of person documents their own depravity? What drives someone to not only torture a child but to create a permanent record of that suffering? In the digital age, evil has found new ways to manifest, and Diana Medina Flores proved that sometimes the most horrifying evidence comes from the perpetrator's own camera. 12-year-old Eduardo Pozo arrived in America with dreams that countless immigrant children share, a chance at a better life, safety, and the love of family. Instead, he found himself trapped in a nightmare that would be documented frame by horrifying frame, creating one of the most disturbing child abuse cases in Indiana's history. Diana Medina Flores seemed like any other stepmother adjusting to a blended family dynamic. She was dating Eduardo's father, Luis Pozo, and had taken on a maternal role with his son. To neighbors and acquaintances, she appeared caring and responsible. But behind closed doors, Diana was orchestrating a campaign of systematic torture that she would meticulously document like a twisted filmmaker creating her masterpiece of cruelty. The year 2019 would become synonymous with Eduardo's suffering, as Diana's abuse escalated from discipline to outright sadism. What makes this case particularly chilling is the evidence she created herself. Hundreds of photos and videos that captured every aspect of Eduardo's torment. She didn't just abuse this child, she archived it, creating a digital museum of horror that would eventually become the key to her conviction. Diana's torture methods were as varied as they were cruel. She would restrain Eduardo for hours at a time, binding his hands and feet until circulation was cut off and his limbs turned purple. The photographs she took show a child in obvious agony, his face contorted with pain and fear. But these weren't images taken in anger or passion. They were carefully composed shots that suggested she took pleasure in documenting his suffering. Starvation became one of Diana's primary weapons. She would deny Eduardo food for days at a time, photographing his increasingly gaunt appearance as if documenting a science experiment. The images show a once healthy 12-year-old boy gradually wasting away, his clothes hanging loose on his shrinking frame. His eyes, once bright with childhood hope, became hollow and desperate as malnutrition took its toll. The physical abuse was relentless and varied. Diana would beat Eduardo with various objects, each assault carefully documented. She burned him with cigarettes and hot objects, creating patterns of scars across his body that told the story of sustained torture. The restraints left permanent marks on his wrists and ankles, evidence of hours spent bound in painful positions while Diana went about her daily activities. Perhaps most disturbing was the psychological element of her abuse. Diana didn't just hurt Eduardo physically, she humiliated him. Many of the photos show the boy naked and vulnerable, positioned in degrading poses that robbed him of dignity, along with his physical well-being. She seemed to understand that breaking his spirit was as important as breaking his body. The torture continued for months, with Diana's digital archive growing larger each day. She stored hundreds of images and videos on her devices, creating what investigators would later describe as the most comprehensive documentation of child abuse they had ever encountered. Each file was time-stamped, creating a precise timeline of Eduardo's deterioration. The horror finally came to light in late 2019, when concerned family members noticed Eduardo's condition during a visit. His dramatic weight loss and obvious injuries couldn't be explained away by Diana's claims of accidents and illness. When authorities were contacted, they discovered not just a severely abused child, but the digital evidence that would ensure justice. The investigation revealed the full scope of Diana's depravity. The photos and videos painted a clear picture of systematic torture that had escalated over months. Medical examinations confirmed the extent of Eduardo's injuries. malnutrition, burns, ligature marks, and evidence of repeated beatings. Psychologists noted severe trauma that would require years of therapy to address. During her trial, Diana's own evidence convicted her. The hundreds of photos and videos she had taken removed any possibility of denial or excuse. The jury saw exactly what Eduardo had endured, documented by the very woman who had inflicted the suffering. Her defense attorneys struggled to explain away such overwhelming evidence of premeditated cruelty. The prosecution painted Diana as a sadist who had turned child abuse into a form of entertainment. The methodical documentation suggested she revisited the images for her own pleasure, treating Eduardo's pain like a collection to be curated and enjoyed. The digital archive revealed not just the acts of abuse, but the mindset of someone who took genuine pleasure in a child's suffering. In 2021, Diana Medina Flores was sentenced to 65 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for the systematic torture of Eduardo Pozo. As she was led away in shackles, the digital evidence that had condemned her served as a permanent reminder that some people document their own evil, creating undeniable proof of their monstrous nature. Eduardo survived his ordeal, but the scars, both physical and psychological, will remain with him forever. The photographs that once documented his suffering now serve a different purpose, ensuring his tormentor will never harm another child. Monique Dillard Bothwell, how long can the human spirit endure isolation? How many days can a 13-year-old girl survive on scraps and hope before her body simply gives up? In Pontiac, Michigan, these questions received horrifying answers when Monique Dillard Bothwell transformed a bathroom into a death chamber for her stepdaughter. Kahayasha Taylor was 13 years old, an age when most girls are worried about friends, school, and discovering who they want to become. Instead, this bright teenager found herself imprisoned in the most degrading conditions imaginable by the woman who was supposed to protect her. Monique Dillard Bothwell didn't just abuse Kahayasha, she erased her, locking her away from the world until she ceased to exist. The year 2009 began with what appeared to be a typical blended family situation. Monique had married Kahayasha's father, taking on the role of stepmother to his teenage daughter. To outsiders, they seemed like any other family navigating the challenges of bringing two households together. But inside their Pontiac home, Monique was orchestrating one of the most methodical and sadistic cases of child abuse in Michigan's history. Monique's decision to imprison Kahayasha in the bathroom wasn't the result of sudden rage or lost control. It was a calculated act of cruelty designed to break the girl's spirit completely. The small, windowless room became Kahayasha's entire world for 2 months, a space barely large enough to lie down in, with no privacy, no comfort, and no hope of escape. The psychological torture of the imprisonment was matched by the physical deprivation Monique inflicted. She would occasionally slide scraps of food under the bathroom door, barely enough to keep a 13-year-old alive. These weren't meals, but cruel reminders of Kahayasha's complete dependence on her captor's whims. Some days, no food came at all, leaving the teenager to wonder if today would be the day Monique decided to let her starve. Completely, water became another weapon in Monique's arsenal of cruelty. While Kahayasha had access to the bathroom sink, Monique would often shut off the water supply, forcing the girl to go hours or even days without adequate hydration. The psychological message was clear. Even the most basic necessities of survival were privileges that could be withdrawn at any moment. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Kahesha's imprisonment. Cut off from school, friends, and any human contact except for Monique's periodic appearances to deliver scraps or verbal abuse, the teenager was left alone with her fear and despair. The bathroom walls became the boundaries of her universe, and each day blended into the next in an endless cycle of hunger, thirst, and hopelessness. Monique's treatment of Kahesha revealed a level of calculated sadism that shocked even experienced investigators. She would occasionally unlock the door, not to free the girl, but to torment her with glimpses of the normal life happening just beyond the bathroom walls. She would describe meals she was preparing for the rest of the family, taunting Kahesha with the sounds and smells of food she wouldn't be allowed to share. The physical deterioration was as predictable as it was heartbreaking. Kahesha's healthy teenage body began consuming itself, her weight dropping dramatically as malnutrition took its toll. Her skin became pale and sallow, her hair began falling out, and her once bright eyes grew dull with the exhaustion of survival. Yet Monique continued the imprisonment, watching this vibrant girl fade away day by day. As weeks turned into months, Kahesha's body began shutting down. Severe dehydration and malnutrition were destroying her organs, but Monique showed no signs of relenting. The bathroom that had become a prison was transforming into a tomb, and only Monique had the key to prevent the inevitable outcome. On a cold day in 2009, Kahesha Taylor's tortured body finally surrendered. When authorities discovered her remains in the bathroom prison, they found a 13-year-old girl who had literally wasted away under Monique's care. The medical examiner determined that death had resulted from severe dehydration and malnutrition. She had starved to death while her stepmother lived comfortably in the same house. The investigation revealed the full scope of Monique's methodical cruelty. Evidence showed that she had systematically isolated and starved Kahesha over a period of months, turning the teenager's own home into a concentration camp. The bathroom showed signs of long-term occupation, confirming that this wasn't a brief punishment but a sustained campaign of torture. During her trial, Monique attempted to portray herself as overwhelmed and struggling with the challenges of step-parenting. But the evidence painted a different picture entirely. The systematic nature of the abuse, the calculated deprivation, and the months-long imprisonment all pointed to a woman who had deliberately tortured a child to death. The prosecution described Monique as a sadist who had treated Kahesha like a caged animal, denying her the most basic human needs until her body could no longer survive. The bathroom prison became a symbol of how completely one person can control another's existence, reducing a vibrant teenager to a victim begging for scraps. In 2011, Monique Dillard Bothwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called her crimes among the most heinous acts of child abuse he had ever encountered. As she was led away to begin her life sentence, the bathroom where Kahesha had died was sealed, but the memory of what had happened there would haunt everyone involved in the case forever. Kahesha Taylor's death serves as a reminder that some people are capable of unimaginable cruelty, even toward those they're meant to protect. Her story demands that we remain vigilant, that we listen when children cry for help, and that we never forget the price of indifference when evil hides behind closed doors. Eliza Baker. What level of evil does it take to murder a child who has already fought cancer? What kind of monster looks at a 10-year-old girl who wears hearing aids and walks with a prosthetic leg and sees not courage but opportunity? In the small town of Hickory, North Carolina, Elisa Baker answered these questions with actions so depraved they shocked a nation and redefined our understanding of human cruelty. Zara Baker was not just any 10-year-old. She was a warrior who had already battled more adversity than most adults face in a lifetime. Born in Australia, this extraordinary little girl had survived bone cancer that cost her a leg and damaged her hearing. Yet Zara's spirit remained unbroken. She adapted to life with prosthetics and hearing aids with the resilience that only children possess, smiling through challenges that would devastate grown men. When Zara's father, Adam Baker, moved to North Carolina and married Elisa Baker in 2008, it seemed like the beginning of a new chapter for this brave little girl. Adam believed he was giving his daughter a mother figure and a stable home in America. Instead, he delivered Zara into the hands of a woman whose hatred for vulnerable children would manifest in ways that defied human comprehension. Elisa Baker was 42 years old when she became Zara's stepmother, old enough to understand the responsibility that came with caring for a disabled child. But where others saw Zara's prosthetic leg and hearing aids as symbols of her incredible courage, Elisa saw weakness to be exploited. The very disabilities that made Zara special also made her the perfect victim for someone with Elisa's twisted psychology. The abuse began subtly, as it often does with predators who understand the importance of maintaining appearances. Elisa would isolate Zara from her father, claiming the child needed special discipline due to her disabilities. She convinced Adam that Zara's medical needs made her difficult to manage, gradually assuming total control over the girl's care and daily routine. What happened next represents one of the most disturbing escalations of child abuse in American criminal history. Elisa didn't just abuse Zara. She targeted her specifically because of her vulnerabilities. The prosthetic leg that helped Zara walk became a weapon in Elisa's hands. The hearing aids that helped her communicate were removed, further isolating the child from any possibility of help. The physical abuse escalated rapidly throughout 2010. Elisa would beat Zara with increasing frequency and severity, focusing her attacks on areas that would be hidden by clothing. She denied the child medical care for her ongoing cancer treatments, effectively sentencing her to death even before the final act of violence. Zara's father, manipulated and deceived by Elisa's lies, remained unaware of the systematic torture happening under his own roof. On the 9th of September 2010, Elisa Baker crossed the final line from abuse into murder. The details of how 10-year-old Zara died remain sealed in plea agreements, but what followed was an act of desecration that haunted investigators for years. Not content with simply killing this brave little girl, Elisa dismembered her body with the methodical precision of a butcher. What makes Elisa's crime particularly heinous is the calculated way she disposed of Zara's remains. She didn't panic or attempt to hide the evidence quickly. Instead, she systematically dismembered the child's body and scattered the pieces across multiple locations throughout North Carolina. Zara's prosthetic leg was found in one location, parts of her torso in another, creating a gruesome treasure hunt that traumatized law enforcement officers across multiple counties. For weeks, Elisa maintained an elaborate charade, pretending Zara was still alive. She filed false missing person reports, participated in search efforts, and even appeared on television pleading for her stepdaughter's safe return, all while knowing that she had brutally murdered and dismembered the child weeks earlier. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Elisa's depravity. Evidence showed that Zara had been dead for weeks, while Elisa continued the pretense that she was missing. The systematic dismemberment and disposal of the body demonstrated a level of premeditation and callousness that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. When confronted with overwhelming evidence, Elisa finally confessed to her role in Zara's death. But even in confession, she showed no remorse for what she had done to this innocent child. The plea negotiations that followed focused not on whether she was guilty, but on avoiding the death penalty in exchange for leading investigators to more of Zara's remains. The trial revealed that Elisa had specifically targeted Zara because of her disabilities. Prosecutors argued that she viewed the child's prosthetic leg and hearing aids not as medical devices but as symbols of weakness to be exploited. The murder wasn't the result of lost temper or momentary rage. It was the culmination of a sustained campaign against a vulnerable child. In 2011, Elisa Baker was sentenced to 15 to 18 years in prison after accepting a plea deal that spared her the death penalty. The relatively light sentence outraged Zara's family and advocates for disabled children, but it was the price paid for recovering more of the little girl's remains and avoiding a lengthy trial that would have further traumatized everyone involved. As Elisa was led away to prison, the true tragedy of Zara Baker's story became clear. This little girl had survived cancer, adapted to life with disabilities, and moved halfway around the world for a chance at happiness. Instead, she found Elisa Baker, and that encounter cost her everything. Zara's story serves as a reminder that the most vulnerable among us are often targeted by the cruelest predators. Her courage in facing cancer and disability should have been celebrated and protected. Instead, it made her the perfect victim for a woman whose evil knew no bounds. Monique Osuna. What drives a woman to systematically destroy the child she promised to love? How does someone look into the eyes of a 9-year-old boy and see not innocence but an object to be tortured? In the quiet community of Weiser, Idaho, these questions found their horrifying answers when Monique Osuna transformed from stepmother into executioner. Emric Osuna was 9 years old when he became trapped in Monique's web of cruelty. This bright, energetic boy should have been playing with friends, learning in school, and discovering the world around him. Instead, he found himself imprisoned in his own home by a woman whose capacity for sustained torture would eventually shock investigators and prosecutors across Idaho. The year 2020 brought more than pandemic fears to the Osuna household. It brought the systematic destruction of a child's life. Monique Osuna, who had married Emric's father and taken on the role of his primary caregiver, began implementing what can only be described as a torture regimen designed to break every aspect of the boy's existence. Monique's abuse of Emric wasn't the result of anger or frustration. It was calculated, methodical, and sustained over months. She seemed to understand exactly how much suffering a 9-year-old body could endure before giving up entirely, and she pushed Emric to that limit day after day, week after week, until his small frame could no longer survive her relentless cruelty. The starvation began first, as it often does with systematic abusers who understand that controlling food means controlling life itself. Monique would deny Emric meals while preparing elaborate dinners for the rest of the family. She would force him to watch others eat while his own stomach cramped with hunger, using his basic need for nourishment as a weapon to maintain psychological control. But food was just the beginning of Monique's arsenal of torture. She subjected Emmerich to physical abuse that escalated in severity and frequency. Over time, beatings became a daily occurrence, each one more vicious than the last. She would target areas of his body that would be hidden by clothing, ensuring that the evidence of her crimes remained concealed from the outside world. The psychological torture was equally devastating. Monique isolated Emmerich from any source of comfort or support, convincing him that his suffering was deserved and that no one would help him even if they knew what was happening. She destroyed his sense of self-worth systematically, ensuring that he felt completely alone and helpless in his ordeal. As months passed, Emmerich's body began showing the devastating effects of prolonged malnutrition and abuse. His weight dropped dramatically, his energy disappeared, and his once bright eyes became hollow with desperation and fear. Yet Monique showed no signs of stopping her campaign of torture. If anything, she seemed energized by the boy's deterioration, finding new ways to inflict suffering on his weakening body. The physical evidence of Monique's crimes was overwhelming. Medical examiners would later document extensive injuries consistent with prolonged, systematic abuse. The pattern of injuries told a clear story of escalating violence over an extended period, with newer injuries layered over older ones in a horrific timeline of sustained torture. What makes Monique's case particularly disturbing is the duration of Emmerich's suffering. This wasn't a single act of violence or even a series of abusive incidents. It was a sustained campaign of torture that continued for months, while the rest of the world remained oblivious to the nightmare playing out behind closed doors. The isolation imposed by the 2020 pandemic may have contributed to Emmerich's suffering by limiting outside contact that might have detected the abuse earlier. With schools closed and social interactions limited, Monique had more opportunities to torture Emmerich without interference or detection from teachers, neighbors, or other family members who might have noticed his deteriorating condition. In early 2020, Emmerich Osuna's tortured body finally surrendered to the sustained abuse. When authorities discovered him, they found evidence of systematic torture so severe that seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. The 9-year-old boy had literally been tortured to death by the woman entrusted with his care. The investigation revealed the full scope of Monique's depravity. Evidence showed that she had subjected Emmerich to months of starvation, beatings, and psychological torture that gradually destroyed his will to live along with his physical health. The systematic nature of the abuse demonstrated that this was not the result of lost control or momentary anger, but calculated cruelty implemented over an extended period. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence against her, Monique Osuna made the rare decision to plead guilty to the charges against her. Perhaps even she recognized that the evidence of her crimes was so extensive and horrifying that a trial would only result in more severe consequences. During her sentencing hearing, the full horror of what Emmerich had endured was laid bare. Medical testimony described injuries and malnutrition so severe that they painted a picture of sustained torture that continued until the child's body could no longer survive. The systematic nature of the abuse demonstrated a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even experienced prosecutors. In 2021, Monique Osuna was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that her crimes represented some of the most sustained and systematic child abuse he had encountered in decades on the bench. As she was led away to spend the rest of her life behind bars, the courtroom fell silent in recognition of the innocent life she had stolen. Emmerich Osuna deserved to grow up, to experience the joys of childhood, and to discover what kind of man he might have become. Instead, he encountered Monique Osuna, and that encounter cost him everything. His story serves as a stark reminder that some people are capable of sustained evil that defies human understanding, and that children are often most vulnerable to those who claim to love them most.